All right. Go ahead and get started. My name is Leslie Jenkins-Reed, and I am the International Service Coordinator for Cooperative for Education. Thank you to host this webinar with Tisha Gaynor of the International Adoption Center at Cincinnati Children's. So just to tell you a little bit about Cooperative for Education. Having some technical issues, of course. So we are a Cincinnati and Guatemala 501c3 founded in 1996. Our mission is to break the cycle of poverty through education in Guatemala. And so over the last 20 years, we've hosted almost 1,000 travelers to Guatemala, and we've had the honor to be part of a number of families connected to Guatemala through adoption. Many of them have come on our trips, and we've had the honor of hosting them. A couple of years ago, after hosting a number of these families, we recognized the need and the unique position of families wanting to travel back to Guatemala with their children. Many families wanted to get to know Guatemala better, get off the beaten path a little bit, and even give back in a safe environment, in a well-planned environment, so that they can, take advantage of the beauty that Guatemala has. So we partnered with the International Adoption Center at Cincinnati Children's in order to craft that experience. And after an incredible trip last year, we wanted to share some of our learnings for families considering traveling to Guatemala or to other countries of their children's birth countries. So I can get my screen to advance. There we go. It's my pleasure to present to you today's main speaker, Tisha Gaynor. Tisha is a mental health therapist and social worker with the International Adoption Center here at Cincinnati Children's. She's originally from Cincinnati and went to Xavier, where many of our staff did. But then she moved north to do her social work and other training at Case Western. But now she's back in the Queen City, as we call it, and has been working with individuals and families through their adoption journey. In addition to advising and training Cooperative for Education staff, Tisha is a resource for us on the Heritage Tour for staff, but mainly for parents and for children. But she knows how to have a little bit of fun too. So without any further ado, I will turn the mic over to Tisha for today's webinar, Hopes, Fears, and Psychological Development, Things to Consider When Planning Birth Country Travel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited you all were able to join us. Like Leslie said, I work with Cincinnati Children's Hospital International Adoption Center. I'll start off with just giving a little brief intro into our services for those of you that aren't familiar. We do offer pre- and post-adoption services. So our pre-adopts, our physician, Dr. Mary Stapp, is available to review your referrals for children to be able to give parents a good understanding of what some of the medical diagnoses are that they may be reading, to get a better understanding of what to expect and help them make that decision if this is a good fit that this family is able to prepare to meet that child's needs. The other service within our pre-adopt program is when families do decide to accept the referral and are traveling in country, she is available 24/7 for any questions or concerns that may arise during that time period, as well as provide any travel medicine related consultation and medications for that child in their transition. Post-adoption, we do have a medical clinic, and we have a large international adoption population here in our tri-state area. But with the limited number of IACs throughout the country now, we do have a lot of families traveling across the country to come get that medical consultation. And also because we are fortunate to have the resources of Cincinnati Children's, we do have the ability to connect with more of our special needs and high medical needs families to get them connected to the providers that can best meet their child's needs. With our medical clinic, we do have a full team of physicians, OT, and social workers to be able to give a full evaluation of the child and needs and help support the family as they transition home. We do see families when they first arrive home, as well as a 1-month follow-up and a 6-month follow-up. That way we can help to be able to troubleshoot and support families throughout that process. Additionally, we do have ongoing mental health services as well, and that is something that's available for our families at any point. So we may start working with the families early on in that adjustment period if we do already identify some behavioral mental health concerns or need assistance in helping with that attachment process, as well as available at any point during that lifespan. So it's not uncommon that we may not see families for several years down the road, and then we start to have some challenges that may or may not be adoption related. It may be mental health, it may be typical child things that we're struggling with, and our therapists are available to help families through that piece as well. Another service that we've begun to offer in the past couple years is a travel clinic. So that is something that's available for any family member, whether they're associated with adoption or not. We do have many families who they're traveling for work and they need to get immunizations or needed some travel consultation, as well as mission trips or just family vacations, in addition to any adoption-related travel as well. If we look at kind of what our goals are for today and what we'll be looking at, I'll go through that with us briefly. So we're going to talk a bit about the different types of birth country travel that families might consider. We'll talk a bit about the research that's out there about birth country travel. We'll discuss some common experiences that people go through during international travel, discuss the role of expectations, explore psychological development, psychosocial development, and how that might impact your child's experience so you can be in thought with that as you're making your decision and planning this trip. And we'll talk also pre and post training, some tips there. So when we think about birth country travel, there's about a lot of various opportunities that are traditional and non-traditional. We have group tours that families may choose to do that are more vacation or cultural experience. So that will be your typical travel group. That would be a variety of different people. Some families do pursue that route, and it isn't adoption specific. They're looking really to experience their child's birth country in that fashion. Some families really do choose to pursue more of an adoption specific tour like that, where you're traveling along with other families who have also adopted from that country. And there's also a lot of cultural experience and vacation opportunities within that as well. Some of those visits may or may not include more looking at heritage issues in terms of visits to a child's orphanage, or there might be some opportunities that families pursue in meeting with birth family or foster families. And that might be something that's a part of those adoption trips, or it might be something that families add on to other more vacation-related trips. We also have families that pursue more independently planned trips. So they choose to do the organization and planning and setting all that stuff up on their own. And then they may also add things to their child and family's experience when it comes to orphanages or connecting with other birth family or foster families there. Another thing that's become a lot more popular is going and traveling for more volunteer-related activities or more short-term mission trips. So again, they may not be connecting with specific adoption-related pieces of their story, but they are going back to their birth country and serving it with their trip or with their church that might be going to Guatemala or China, or serving with different volunteer organizations there. Another common thing that we see too is simply going back for a sibling adoption. Some families choose to just go as parents there and have someone taking care of the other children at home, where other families choose to do that as a family, and then that adopted child is coming along as well in that process, and that is another way that that child might experience birth country travel. It seems to be that international travel among schools is becoming a lot more popular as well, so we have children that, again, are going and not necessarily associated with an adoption experience and anything there, but they are going along with their band and performing, or going along with their chorus or study abroad programs. Oops, let's go back one more. Ooh, sorry about that. Thank you. So with these different options, there's lots of benefits to each and lots of things to consider there. One positive thing when you're looking at a travel group that is adoption specific, it is more and more common now for those groups to have mental health providers a part of their tours, as well as we recognize that need for support for families and for kids as they make that journey. When we're looking at more independent travel and things that families can choose to plan on their own, that does allow them a little more flexibility, and that is one reason they choose to do that, because if you're traveling with a group, you are with their itinerary generally. Some programs may be able to offer some flexibility with that, but some families like to be able to kind of give themselves their own space and their own time to plan that. The downside of that being is you are wearing your parent hat on top of tour guide hats and planning and having to orchestrate all those things that go along with travel. When we're looking at other more non-traditional things such as the volunteer trips or mission trips, that allows children and families to really have the cultural experience that isn't really focused on the adoption piece, and that might be a big motivating factor for them. It does also allow for kids to have that experience to traveling with peers and being able to make friendships and connections and relationships. One thing to consider is some of the things such as school trips or maybe even some of the volunteer trips, they may be with just the child. So with that, really taking into consideration how that's a good fit for your child, traveling without their family and without that support, because the reality is, regardless of how we're going about traveling to our birth country, even if it isn't an adoption trip necessarily, there is an opportunity to have those feelings and those thoughts that occur, and being able to make sure that child has a level of support that would be beneficial for them is really important to consider. When we look, a lot of families are also very curious of, what does the research currently say when we're thinking of birth country travel? And the unfortunate thing is there's really not a lot of literature out there right now. It's very challenging to research this because it's really a small sample size, a lot of selection bias, and there's really a lack of comparison groups to look at the outcomes. So really there aren't outcome studies per se. The focus really in research is how to best prepare children and families for this trip and for this journey. So really what we're focusing on today. Most of the research articles in the beginning were really focusing more on birth culture socialization. So that's a gamut of things that may include travel, but we're also looking at what experiences children can partake in and experience their culture within their current community as well. Research studies there that are looking more specifically at birth country travel tend to be more case studies, and we're looking at more anecdotal experiences, and it tends to be adults and their retroactive experiences. So the benefit with that is it gives us some insight into what they perceive being the challenges and the benefits that they experienced during that time, but they proceeded into adulthood, so it's really looking back and their journey and what they've learned. So there's not a lot out there in terms of really what does that child experience in the short term with such trips.
I'm listening to the webinar.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
With that, I think in looking for resources, I think a lot of families, a big question for them is when is the best time? When is the right time? And is there the right age? And really there is no perfect time, there is no perfect age. It is a very individual experience both for the child and for the family. In looking through the research, one thing that they do look at is a recommendation of, if at all possible, the best scenario is more than one trip. So that provides the opportunity to be able to expose the child back into their birth culture at a very young age, where we can really focus on more the cultural experiences and the beauty and the customs of the culture, and then pursue coming back at a time when they are maybe more interested in the adoption aspect. When we look at other recommendations within the literature to help prepare families, and we'll talk in more detail some of these things, but again, it's very individual to the child and family, and really considering the child's personality, their temperament, what their desire is and interest in this kind of travel, what their current mental health status is, and how they're coping with things in general, and really looking at where they are in the developmental spectrum. I'll start off also looking at what are some of the common challenges that people experience just in international travel in general. So there's the obvious fatigue and jet lag. So this is more significant depending obviously on what country you're traveling in, but that is something to really consider as well, and how your child and how you handle those scenarios. Oftentimes there is an exposure to poverty that we don't see to that degree here in this country, and oftentimes children, that is their first true exposure of poverty to a level that they, again, have not experienced here and may not have fully understood or seen when they were in their birth country. there's an absence of routines. So we are all creature of habits, and especially kids really thrive on routines. And those things are things that we try our best to replicate as much as we can when we're traveling, but our creature comforts and things like that are going to be disrupted during travel. Access to our preferred foods, even our access to water, is very different than it is here at home. And for a lot of people, it's a great thing. They're really looking forward to trying foods and having those experiences there. But after a long trip, sometimes somebody really wants some McDonald's. And so keeping those things in mind, and good or bad, there is a pretty good access in most countries to some Western food as well. So there is some of those opportunities for some kiddos and for some families. But even the impact of drinking out of bottled water, and again, kind of reiterating that exposure to poverty, a lot of kids and even adults, that is one kind of very obvious in your face thing that they're looking at and seeing that, okay, I can't even drink the water here, that's not safe. Challenge, and we'll go into more detail with this, is really considering the emotional response of parents, not even just the child and the other kids in the family, but the parents and their coping. Identifying and dealing with unmet expectations, which again is something we'll talk a bit more about, and standing out. Just being that visible difference within as you're traveling, not even just kind of traveling in a group and the kind of attention that gets, but as well as our family standing out and looking different. And that may be something that wasn't necessarily thought of. And again, we'll explore that a bit more through our expectations. So we look at expectations, considering the child's expectations. A very common experience for our kiddos is, in most of their communities, it is improving, I think, in areas that have some more diversity, but in a whole, most of the time, their experience is, they don't have a lot of people that look like them, and they also don't have a whole lot of families that look the way that their family looks. So there could be a level of expectation when they do get to their birth country of, I'm going to have people around me that I can relate to. And that may be something that is maybe not even an expectation, but it's something that they face when they do get off that plane and when they are in country. For parents, some of their expectations can vary a bit differently. They may be looking to help kind of put some definition for their child, be able to have some closure for them. Sometimes if there's some challenges going on, or say there's been some difficulty with attachment or that transition, they're hoping this will help resolve some of those issues for their child. Some families really look at trying to provide the child the opportunity to have an appreciation for life. And for families that are going as a full family unit, for having siblings to better understand their adopted sibling and their experience. So, those I think are some common expectations that I hear from kids and from families. And so looking at the reality, and the reality is a lot of times in country, the parents are really the ones that are having that unexpected emotional reaction when in country. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I think a big piece is they're really kind of put back smack dab through their adoption experience. When you walk off that plane and there is all those smells and sounds and the people and the hustle and bustle can really bring you back to that place of when you first got off that plane to bring your child home. So that can really stir up a lot of emotional experiences for families, as well as developing this intense connection with their child's heritage that, in the adoption process, it's such a scattered trip that this gives them the opportunity for that, and that can be a very intense experience. As well as seeing your child in their birth country and making that connection with their heritage, can be a really unexpected response for families during that trip. And on the flip side, for kids, it's often very common that they are very wrapped up in kind of the vacation aspect of this trip. So they're really excited about the things that have been planned. They're excited of kind of doing new things. And so in the moment, they may or may not necessarily be processing things in the same way that parents are, which does not mean that they're not thinking about these things, but we may not necessarily be getting the questions and the verbalization. They're really taking these experiences in, and their process really often begins when they get home, and sometimes long after they get home. So we may experience more communication once we get home, but a lot of times you're going to see some of those things more behaviorally. A lot of the common themes, as kids are working through some of their experiences and the emotions and memories that this might bring up, sometimes there's anger, there's grief, there's questions. And I think a big common theme is this idea of survivor guilt. Why me? after they may have gone and seen their birth family or their foster family or visited the orphanage, or even just seen people in the community, is, how am I able to have this life? To kind of give us a different spin on looking at birth country travel, we're going to look through things from more psychological and developmental perspective, and following Erik Erikson's developmental stages. And I'm going to go through some of these beginning ones a little quickly, and then we're going to end more in the early adult lifespan. So when we look at the beginning stages, trust and mistrust is the theme for our first year of life. This is where attachment is formed. This is where infants are learning whether or not the world is safe and people meet my needs. So in that, trust is developed when they have that hope that people will continue to be there, my basic needs will be met. Mistrust often develops when there's fear and anxiety and heightened insecurity. So with this, and we think of this through the lens of adoption, this is oftentimes where that break happens for a lot of our kiddos. Whether they are going straight into an orphanage or whether they've had some time with their family before they are disrupted there, they're oftentimes in this phase of not necessarily knowing and getting their needs met from a very early period. Our next phase is autonomy versus shame, which is the 18 to 3-year-old mark. So here we've got very active kiddos. This is where they're developing skills and practicing and learning new things. They're really learning how to be independent. In order to do this in a successful manner, they really need a lot of encouragement for that exploration. So that autonomy is developed when they have the confidence and security based on that support and encouragement from their caregivers. And on the other end, when they experience criticism, when they're controlled, when they have inadequacy, feelings of doubt, and even trauma, shame is often a thing that develops within that developmental stage. So when we are considering adoption themes here, oftentimes in this phase, this is when a lot of our kids first come home for adoption. So other things that you're dealing with in this time period is kind of that catch-up phase, where we expect a lot of our kiddos when they first come home to have a level of delays developmentally. So some of these things might continue on in their next phases as well with that scattered development. And our next stage of development, initiative versus guilt, is that 3 to 5 year mark. And again, this is also a period of time where kids are commonly coming home as well. This is where interpersonal skills are being practiced and developed. Play is their language. That is how they're exploring the world. You have lots of questions, a lot of explorations, a lot of whys. And in this period, developing their initiative. And that is when their decision making is being encouraged. Those interpersonal skills are being encouraged, and that exploration. And guilt can be something that develops there when they're shamed for those things, when they're more controlled and their creativity is inhibited. So things to consider when we're discussing adoption-related issues here within this phase is the kiddos here need a lot of repetition to really learn adoption-related things. Magical thinking is a very common part of this stage, so needing very concrete, simple explanations. So I think back that a lot of times that's when you hear kids talking about, I've got my mommy, I've got my tummy mommy. So they need some very concrete examples to help form that thought process and really put things in space and time. In this time, it's really important to be able to review photo books over the course of development, the things that you might have to be able to connect their child with recognizing their life and their birth country and what adoption means and what that story is. Looking at life books, having those things visible to the child and opportunities to be able to discuss those things and learn more. This age is also a good time to even start talking about travel and birth country travel. And again, we may have some kids getting some early exposure with that if they're going on for another adoption. In this period, when we talk about that, the worry that can be developed there is that they're going to be returned. So we might use the phrase, we're going back to Guatemala or we're going back to China. And sometimes there is that concrete thought that means I'm not coming back. So the recommendation there is thinking about and using this over the course of lifetime is we're going to visit. We're not returning to the birth country. We're not going back, we're visiting to help make those things more concrete in their mind. And again, also within this phase, just practicality reasons, they're very sensitive to changes in routines and sleep deprivation. So we move into our next stage, which is kind of more the school age, where they're developing competency versus inferiority. So academics is the focus within this developmental stage. Teachers are really influential for their lives. They're also developing a greater peer influence and approval seeking. So they're wanting to be liked, they're finding ways to fit in, they're trying new things to be able to make those connections with peers and with others. So as they develop competence, they're experiencing encouragement when those initiatives are reinforced. So they're really feeling that support within their support system. But inferiority is a challenge there when they feel more restricted and when that causes more doubts in their own abilities. So with an adoption in this stage, this is when they're developing a better understanding of the meaning adoption. And then, kids tend to revisit those things at each developmental stage. So as we process along the stages of development, they're examining it more and having a different understanding. So, as the world gets bigger and as your thoughts get more complex, they may start to ask more questions. So they're really trying to piece those things together to reinforce what they've learned and what they've been told. Here's when, again, because their world is getting bigger and their peers are more of an influence, this is when they start to recognize more that, what, in my community, I look different. My family's different. You may see at this stage that because of the hustle and bustle of life, and we've gotten into our routines after the adoption and we're in school, is that there may be less of a talking about adoption, and that isn't something that is as prevalent in our conversations in our daily lives. But I really encourage families in this stage to continue that communication, that even if the child isn't talking about it, and I think that's probably something that, in the early stages of adoption, that probably parents weren't given the best advice. I think families initially were told, well, they'll bring it up, they'll talk about it when they're ready. And I don't think that's always the case. I think that sometimes they need to know it's okay to talk about that. So the more that you lead with that example, that helps them to be able to know it's okay. It's safe for me to talk about this. It's okay for me to have questions. It's okay for me to want to go back to my birth country and visit. And if we allow those words to be heard out of our own mouths as parents, that can help them feel more secure in being able to discuss those things and bring them up. And another piece there is, as kids are in this stage, they tend to talk more about these feelings and questions outside of the family system too. And I think oftentimes this is when families might consider getting a therapist involved to be able to provide a child an outlet and somebody to trust and communicate with that's outside of the family to help process some of these questions. So when we're thinking about birth country travel in this stage or just having those conversations, again, that idea of being returned can be a fear that's still within this developmental phase as well. So, using language of talking about visiting, we're going back and touring, taking the idea of returning back to our birth country kind of out of our language there. Again, in this age, we're really, we see kids focusing more on the fun and adventure side of birth country travel, wanting to take in the cultural aspects. And adoption-related themes may or may not be something that they're incredibly focused on during that time. We may see more curiosity and more likely to ask questions. Another common theme within this population is when they are on trips, they're really connecting with other peers. And again, that may or may not be in talking about adoption or their stories, but they're wanting to connect and, having that opportunity, if they're on an adoption tour, to be able to be with other kids, even if they don't talk about it, they know what they've experienced and they have some similarities there. Within this age group, we also see more of a sensitivity to poverty. So keeping that in mind and helping prepare kids for that trip, because that could be the first time they've really been exposed to that level of poverty. And depending on the age of the child when they were adopted, at this phase, they may have very concrete memories of being in their birth country, of being with their birth family, foster family, whatever their background is. And even if they don't have those concrete memories, typically kids will fill in the blanks and they'll have created scenarios or they'll create experiences to fill those pieces in. So that is, I think, important for families to know about when we think about expectations. So they may have some ideas of what it's going to be like, which may or may not fit into that reality. And it's also important to, consider any trauma and how they've handled loss when we're in this stage, to be able to help make the best decision and timing for them in their travels. And we have the ever fun teen years of 12 to 18 when we're looking at identity versus role confusion. So here, our older kids are seeking a sense of self, exploring their personal identity. They're deciding what their values and beliefs and goals are. Asserting their independence is an important piece here, and really having that exposure to planning for the future. So we're getting, talking about high school, we're talking about college, we're making plans of, what do you want to be when you grow up? So there's a lot of future focus as well as having to live in the moment of everyday life in school. Body image and sexual identity are an important part of this developmental phase. And being able to develop security in one's identity allows them to have, is when they really come to a place of acceptance of their self and others. Role confusion is really common within this period, and it may be something that continues on. And common things there that might influence that is, with a child who might feel pressured into an identity, or they have a more unsure sense of their self or their place in society. In terms of adoption's themes within this developmental stage, some are really actively seeking out their feelings about adoption, because they're looking back at their beliefs and their values. They may be wanting a greater exploration of what their life was like, what was more of the details and circumstances behind their adoption. So it's important in this period that even if we have a kid who might be turned off on that, you might not be getting the questions, they may not want anything to do with adoption, having that open door, having check-ins to be able to, let them know that it is an okay thing to talk about when they are ready to talk about that. And when we are looking in these pieces of personal identity and sense of self, a common theme for somebody who is exploring their adoption history is that feeling of not good enough, and those things can be things that get triggered on an adoption trip that we can talk a bit more about too as well. Along those lines also, as they are thinking more holistically about their life and their experiences, oftentimes in this stage, they will experience some divided loyalties between their birth families as well as their adoptive families, and trying to sort those things out. So when we're thinking about adoption trips here and looking at birth country travel, things to think about and consider is that, again, they're having more complex thoughts. They're really seeing the world as a different place and having more complex desires. And that might be putting them in a place where they're wanting more exploration, or that might be something that's really triggering a lot of insecurity for them, and they may not feel ready for that. They're highly connected to and influenced by their peers during this period of time, which is why I think that there are some travel groups that really focus more on teen-specific travel and to be able to provide that support with them. And in these teen years, being different and standing out does not feel good necessarily. So some of that often comes into play when we're thinking about birth country travel. And the last stage that we'll talk about here today is our young adult 18 to 40. And Erickson looked at this as intimacy versus isolation. So here we're exploring our relationships and long-term commitments outside of our family system. We develop happy relationships, and a sense of commitment and safety in relationships allow us to develop intimacy. Experiencing isolation was when this individual is avoidant of intimacy and commitments within relationships. So when we're thinking of adoption issues here, it's commonly, and we're in these early adult stages, there's a sense of closure that this person might be looking for. So really looking at what are my hopes, what are my expectations when I'm thinking about traveling. Another thing to really think about here, whether you are an adoptee or you have an adult adoptee that we're thinking of traveling with, is, is this something that they're seeking out and they want and need their adoptive family to be a part of this trip? Is this something that they're in relationships, or maybe they're already married and they want their family to be a part of this trip with them? Or is this something they really want to do on their own and have a solo experience? So we will look next at some kind of planning things. We've already talked a bit about some things to consider from a psychosocial standpoint, developmental standpoint there, and I think we're going to wait and do questions more at the end. So we're going to think about what are things to consider. So we've talked about looking at motivations and expectations. So this is, a family experience. What, as parents, are you what is your rationale, what is your hopes, what are your expectations in looking at this trip, but also what does your child and what did the siblings, what do they hope to gain, and what are the experiences they would want from this trip. How many trips are we anticipating? You know, for some families, again, we talked about making multiple trips. That is something that's realistic. And for other families, that because of the time or the finances involved in this, this may or may not be something that we can pursue more than once during their childhood. So when is the right time, and when is that something that a child is ready for? So in helping us make that decision, really considering the developmental age of the child. So again, your child may or may not kind of fit those buckets when it comes to those developmental stages we looked at, because it is common for our kiddos to have some delays. So really considering, where does my child fit in, what are their needs, and how can this, what supports can we put into place to help this be successful? What are the coping strategies? And I think that's a really important thing to consider, because thinking about it in advance will help us determine, do we need to develop some of those strategies? Is this something we need to talk more about and develop before we're ready to do a trip? Because we all decompensate under stress. And you know, that's also something to think about as the parent as well. What are my coping skills? What will I have access to during the trip? To be able to have my own self-care, but also support my children as well. Thinking about, what are the child's current views on adoption, and where are they at in terms of attachment within the family system? You know, discussing with your child, what are their desires, what are their expectations, and really including your child in the trip planning is a really important piece to be able to maybe get more information on that, especially for a child who's maybe not so forthcoming with that information or with their feelings. So researching and making it a very active experience with your child is really, really helpful. So we're doing a lot of visuals. So, you know, getting online, looking up the area, you know, that can also be a good way to help teach about some of the things that they're going to be experiencing, in terms of what will they see when they get off a plane, what does poverty look like there, to be able to help them get some concrete ideas of what to expect. That can also help them identify, what are the things that they hope to get out of this, what are the things that they want to see along their journey. And I really encourage you to explore all the different travel options. We talked about a lot of different ways that families pursue birth country travel, but really looking at the country specific for your family, and what are the different companies and groups that are out there. Looking at what they offer, how are they designed? Is it something that they have a mental health person on staff that goes along or consults with them? And seeking some recommendation referrals from other families that you may know. And your adoption agency can also be helpful in that as well, providing some recommendations there. And I also really encourage families to do some volunteer work beforehand. Again, that's a good opportunity to, you know, consider whether we want to make this trip something that we also have more of a volunteer aspect to, but also to be able to, you know, expose the child to, you know, other things that they may also see when they are traveling internationally too, in terms of poverty and need. And that can be helpful, so that we can build upon those experiences and communicate those things prior to the trip. And I really encourage families, you know, as they're thinking through this, talking with a therapist to discuss the individual child and family. You know, we can talk very, very good recommendations and very overall things to consider, but each family is different, each child is different. So having somebody to sit down with and be able to talk about those things and bounce ideas off and get recommendations can be really helpful for families. So in travel, transition objects can be really helpful. So what is something that the child is already attached to? You know, what is something that might already have the smells from home that's reminding, you know, of them of their comforts? That could be photos, that could be a shirt, that could be a lovey, a teddy bear, you know, something that they can have with them to be able to provide comfort if they are feeling stressed out or just needing some reminders of their home. Taking photos is a great way to be able to help engage a child in the experience, but really kind of having a fine line with that, because I think we can also remove ourselves from the experience by focusing so much on taking pictures that, you know, and preventing us from really being able to be in the moment. Journaling is a great way, and I know that's not everybody's way of coping and processing things, but I think it is a good way to be able to document the experience, because it is such an overwhelming time, and you're often very busy and going from activity and experience to another activity, that even if you do a little bullet journal where here's what I did today, here are the 3 feelings that I had. Here's my favorite memory from the day. That way it can help us when we are back home and we're really looking over our experience. Snacks are huge. Having those on hand, because again, we're dealing with jet lag, we're dealing with unexpected changes, having that there and being able to take that out of the equation when we're having a meltdown or we're just really, really tired and we just need a bit of a pick-me-up. And again, that's not just for the child, that's for us as adults as well. Being able to have downtime within your travels, I think, is a really important piece. And that could be something to really ask when you're pursuing with a company, how do they factor that into your travels? Helping a child know what to expect. So going over the itinerary and whether that's something that you're doing as you're planning it, if this is something you're orchestrating, versus looking over the itinerary on a daily basis, sometimes a couple of times a day, to help orient the child on what to expect, providing daily reminders with that when you're traveling. I really recommend also refraining from promises, and I probably should have talked about that earlier, especially in the planning process. Things change. There's a lot of things that we have to go with the flow with when we're traveling, but also when we're looking at if there are plans to make any visits, say to an orphanage or a meeting with foster families or with birth families. We're planning, we're doing the best that we can, but really refraining from promises in case some of those things do not pan out. Sorry about that. If you are planning on making any of those kind of visits, really considering the timing of that. A good recommendation is to be able to give yourself some time when you arrive, because we're dealing with just the overwhelming and exhaustion pieces of travel, that if we allow ourselves a few days to orient ourselves there, to get some sightseeing in, to get some familiarity with the country and our surroundings, that can help make that process go a bit better. And rather than dealing with the overwhelming feelings of travel and then jumping right into an experience like that. And I think it's really helpful too, if you're going to add something like that onto an organized trip, doing that at the end of the trip. And that can provide a very good experience because you're really having more of exposure to the cultural aspects of that before you go and do any of these more personal visits. Code words can be really, really helpful to be able to give your child the ability to communicate, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I really don't like this, or I need a break. They may not feel comfortable using those exact words, so developing a code word within your family. Or maybe it's a squeeze of a hand. Maybe we're squeezing 3 times. Something that's very obvious to you as a parent, what they're communicating, even if they aren't using the words for that. So family check-ins, throughout the day, especially at the end of the day, you can wrap that into a journaling experience to see how things are. Children often don't always give us a lot of information. When you think, how was your day? You're probably going to get just a very basic answer. So really giving them, leading by example. One thing that you can do as well, when we saw this, I felt really scared. How did you feel? Wow, when I saw this, I was really excited to be able to talk with these people. How did you feel during that? Or I noticed that, you looked really excited when we were on the zip line. Tell me what that was like for you. So being able to give them a lead in there rather than a more of an open-ended question. And then returning home. Creating a printed memory book can be a really awesome experience because it is something that you're working on as a family together. And I really emphasize a printed memory book because it's very easy to have our digital books and our folders and to look through, which are fantastic. But being able to have something that is there and you can have on the bookshelf, the child can have in their room, and it can create other opportunities for conversation or reflection down the road. And a good way of doing this too is having it's something that you're doing over time and it's on a schedule. So we might be working on this once a week on Thursday nights, or we might do it, the first Friday of the month, something like that. So it is something that is planned and a part of your schedule, because we all know what life is like when we get back. We jump right back into work or to school, and sometimes that's something that we have good intentions with, but really making that a priority. Now coming back, also consider ways that you can stay connected to your child's birth country. So that might be in making plans for another trip, or it might be connecting with an organization that supports kids in that country. How can you support a child there? How can we offer some volunteer opportunities? Leading communication is really important, and we talked about that leading with your own feelings and your own experiences to help let the child know that those things are okay to talk about. And recognizing that your child's going to process this experience over time, especially as they're younger, as they get through each developmental stage, they're going to be looking at this experience along with their thoughts about adoption in very different ways. So again, having those printed memories or those journals could be really good things to have for them to reflect on over time. And again, consulting with a therapist, because we know that with kiddos, as they process this over time and these experiences after the trip, having somebody who's a neutral party can be helpful, and also helpful for you as parents on how to best support your child. So those are just some references and looking at some of the research-related things, as well as some of the mental health pieces and birth country travel. So I will turn it over to lovely Miss Leslie.
Well, I realized it was kind of not fair that I snuck in some pictures of Tisha without sharing any of myself. So here's me in my somewhat natural habitat in Guatemala, but I make silly faces too. So I just wanted to embarrass myself a little bit while I was at it. But I also want to tell you a little bit more about Cooperative for Education's approach to birth country travel. We work specifically in Guatemala, so that's the travel option that we offer. But we focus on having that fun family vacation, that cultural experience that can help kids experience their birth country. As an organization, we take care of all the logistics. We have over 20 years of planning trips to Guatemala. So we take care of everything from the restaurants to the hotels to having those experiences that many families are looking for. We also take care of the safety aspects, and so you don't have to worry about where you're headed or being on alert all the time. And really the purpose of all of that is so that you and your family can enjoy the beauty of Guatemala. So some of the things that we do in order to do all of this is we might go zip lining through some of Guatemala's beautiful foliage. We'll learn about the Mayan roots of chocolate and even enjoy a bite or two while we're at it. We will sail on beautiful Lake Atitlan, which is definitely you can't miss when you travel to Guatemala. We'll explore Guatemala's rich history by visiting a Mayan site, but also the Spanish colonial capital of Antigua. So learning about the rich and varied history of this country. And there's also an opportunity to give back by getting our hands dirty a little bit at schools that are served by Cooperative for Education's programs. So working side by side with your family, but also with kids is a great way to make those connections and to learn a little more about Guatemala. We try to experience more of Guatemala's culture by getting to know people, just everyday folks like you and me. But really, our approach is all about celebrating Guatemala and Guatemalan heritage, so that can be part of your family's story as well. So this year, our dates are July 9th through 15th, and a lot of people ask us when's the right time to go. I'm sure Tisha has heard this question many times, but really the answer is when it's right for you and your child. Our trips are geared more towards kids 10, 11, and older, but whenever is right for your family. We also have hosted adult adoptees, and so that's another consideration as well. We keep our group small, about 15 to 20 people. So that's 4 or 5 families, and so that you can the kids can bond with each other and kind of as a community of people connected to Guatemala through adoption. We can have those shared experiences and support one another. In addition to the support of Tisha from the International Adoption Center. We often hear, do I need to speak Spanish? And the answer to that is no, because you'll be with our bilingual staff the whole time. And another question that we often hear is, will my family be safe? And of course, there's never any guarantee, but we have 20 years of running tours in Guatemala, and we take security and safety very seriously. And so we focus on taking care of all of that so that you can enjoy your visit to Guatemala. So I'd like to open up the floor if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask me or Tisha. We would be very happy to answer them. All right, well, you could also shoot us an email, shoot me an email.
Sorry, I have a question. Do you have any recommendations? What if your child is like not at all interested? Any ways to pique their interest? They're like, no, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. I have actually he's 17 now. Has no interest in even exploring that. Do you have any recommendations, any ways to kind of work up to it? Because I assume an answer would be never, I mean, I could force it as like a family vacation and we're just going to see Guatemala, but do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a great way to open that door. That if the idea of framing it as, you know, birth country travel seems overwhelming to your child and thinking about, you know, the adoption related themes that are present there, looking at it as more of a cultural experience that, you know, we want to go back to Guatemala, here are the things that we would like to see, you know, being able to look at, you know, some of the great pictures that Leslie is able to provide to be able to see what the country is like, and we're really just going to experience that just like we would when we're traveling somewhere else. I think that could create some open doors maybe for your child to be able to feel more comfortable exploring that. But I think you also have to honor, you know, especially as a 17-year-old, where that person's at as well, and not knowing, you know, he or she individually, you know, if any other things that might be going on to aid in that resistance there. But it might be something that, you know, if they haven't had a lot of connection to Guatemala, you know, since they've been home, you know, creating some opportunities there could be something as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we've been trying to inch towards there. We've been to Mexico, we've been to Colombia. We're kind of reaching to where eventually we'll be in Guatemala, but okay, thank you.
We also had another question about meeting with birth parents for the first time and how to prepare for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, and I think the best way to look at that is being able to look at the resources that you have already. So a lot of times, you know, maybe you might have already created a life book, or you've looked at different pictures or whatever resources that you already have. You know, being able to look at those things, you know, even if you looked at them a million times over the years, being able to do that leading up in the planning of the trip as well as going into the trip can really help prepare the child in a sense of that and connecting with their story there. You know, I also really encourage of, you know, just sitting down and, you know, depending on the age of your child, you know, that might be something that we really do more play-based than we do with words. So maybe utilizing art, you know, if we're connecting with a therapist there, that person can use, you know, a lot of different expressive ways to be able to explore and help prepare the child, you know, with whatever their thoughts or expectations are. You know, but really starting there, you know, what do you think it's going to be like? You know, here's what, you know, what they look like from the pictures, or here's what we know from the report. You know, what do you think the person's going to be like now? What do you hope to be able to do?
All right, thank you so much, Tisha. Someone else also asked about advice to approach potential questions and voids where when visiting, such as wanting to visit places in the past but that may not exist anymore, or that there aren't birth country connections to be explored. How can we navigate that?
Yeah, and I think that's probably a very common thing for a lot of families, that there may be that desire on the child's part, and even on the parent's part, but it's not a reality, because so many times with our kiddos, there's so many unknowns, or it's not allowed to be able to go to the orphanage. So, you know, I think in those times, really validating the child's wishes and desires, like, you know, I know you really would want to do that, and I would love to be able to do that, and it stinks that we can't. You know, what might be some other things that we could do? You know, some families have, you know, opted to do tours, and, you know, I'm thinking specifically with China, you know, because it is very common that a lot of times they are restricted to be able to go and make connections with the orphanage or their foster family there, but they can find a program or a volunteer opportunity within a travel group to be able to have an experience, even if it isn't their orphanage, but to be able to go if that is something that is an interest and a priority.
All right, any other questions before we sign off? Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We will send out a link to the audio and presentation so that you can view this again later, or share it with other folks that you know might have these same, might be thinking about these same things. So thanks again for your time, and be looking for the web link via email. Thank you so much to Tisha Gaynor from International Adoption Center at Cincinnati Children's. It's really a pleasure to have you and to have you host this webinar for us.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody, and have a lovely March afternoon.